Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. Today, we're talking about driving change in legal. We had a webinar last month about using design thinking principles to drive innovation in the legal space and just set up your function so that it's more scalable. And the number one question we got was, this is all well and good, but how do we drive change? How do we influence people to take on these innovative ways of working and new processes? And how do we make the most of it rather than spending our time just managing pushback? So I thought Dan and Isabel would be the perfect panelists for this discussion. And I'm really happy to have you both here. So Isabel, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you very much, Electra, for having me, and hello, everybody there. So I'm Isabel Parker. I'm a lawyer, and for many years I worked at Freshers Brookhouse Deringer as a lawyer, and then doing a bunch of change stuff, including the latter part of my career, leading their client-facing digital product development as Chief Legal Innovation Officer. And I left there a couple of years ago. I now do some consulting, and I'm also the lead of the Digital Legal Exchange, which works with corporate legal teams, helping them drive their digital transformations with the enterprise. So I'm kind of coming at it from a digital transformation angle, but change isn't just about digital, it's about all sorts of other elements. I'm sure we'll touch on that during this webinar, but that's me. Thank you for having me.
Great. And Isabel's also just very lovely. And when we first met, we clicked with one of those people. So I'm really happy to have you here. And Isabel, you wrote a book, didn't you, recently?
I did. Hey, thanks for the promotion. I did write a book about successful digital transformation in law firms, available at all good bookstores, so I'm told. Yeah, that was a labor of love. Don't undertake it lightly, people. It's hard work. But yeah, because I'm very interested in change. I'm quite mission driven when it comes to particularly digital change. And I wanted to share what I'd learned through 24 years of doing it in a law firm environment, and how it can practically be achieved in all sorts of environments, but particularly in a law firm environment. So yes, the book is out there if you want to buy it.
Excellent. We'll drop a link in the chat if people want to have a look.
Thank
you. Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. So my name's Dan Connors. I'm one of the co-founders of the Applied Influence Group. We're a specialist influence consultancy. And influence is just changing how people think, feel and act in a way that aligns with your goal. And that's clearly important to any kind of change, but is applicable in many, many other areas as well. We learned what we know about influence on high stakes military intelligence operations. So I spent a full career in the British Army, predominantly working in intelligence roles. And during that time, we had to influence some really challenging stakeholders. When we started out doing that, we weren't particularly good. We relied on some real legacy thinking. And over a period of time, due to the situations we found ourselves in, we had to develop an effective methodology to influence as a team. And influence is a team sport. And if there's one thing that you take away from this, take that away, that it's not just about you influencing stakeholders. Influence is a team sport. So we developed this methodology over an extended period of time. There was a group of us leaving the military around about the same time in 2016. My business partner, Emma, had realized that you could point this methodology that we developed at a whole host of business objectives. And we've spent the last 6 years doing that, everything from working with high value business to business sales, working on change programs, anywhere where you need to change how people think, feel and act. Down to, I spent some of my time last year working with a Major League Baseball team where some of their staff need to influence some of their players' thinking. So really, really broad. And hopefully you'll find some of the things we'll talk about today useful.
Definitely. Well, it's riveting, Dan, and your background is just so interesting. And I know you play it down, but it is amazing to have had that experience and to view managing change in such a different way that just not many people have ever had a chance to think about it like that. Also, how scary, but yeah. But basically, as I said earlier, the number one challenge that I think lots of lawyers find when they're trying to drive change internally is where they start. And it's very complex. So before I started TLB, I worked for a big tobacco company, and my job there was to deliver a contract. So I negotiated this large IT infrastructure contract with a big systems integrator, and then my job was to effectively operationalize it and get people that were not legal or had no real interest in contracts and what they said, to make sure that they were doing what they needed to do so that we could hold the supplier to account effectively and ensure that the project was successful. And that includes lots of change management, especially in a company that historically had a lot of money and wasn't really used to someone saying to them, you need to behave in a certain way. And I thought the contract and the operationalization of it would be the challenge, but actually human behaviors was the biggest challenge and also the most interesting part of the whole thing. What I thought was quite surprising is how you can almost target people that you don't really initially think are the main stakeholders, to influence them, to influence others. And Dan, you did a training for TLB, I think it was 1.5 years ago now, where you talked about that stakeholder mapping piece and how you find the people that do drive the influence and how often they're not the ones who you think initially are the people to target first. Can you talk us through that a bit more?
Yeah, certainly. So when we're looking at influencing any complex situation where you've got multiple stakeholders, spending some time plotting out, discussing with your team who the most important stakeholders are to influence and how much influence you have over those individuals is really, really important. And understanding the relationships between those people. And as Electra said, often when you go through any kind of formal stakeholder mapping process, you will identify that those who sit at the top of a hierarchy, whether that's the CEO, the COO, or anyone else at the C-suite level, for specific situations that you're trying to drive change in, they may not be the most important. And it might be someone lower down the organization who's really well connected with others, who if you can influence them successfully, they will influence on your behalf. So thinking about those individuals, and then thinking about what the different messages are that you need to get to those different individuals. So the message that you're delivering to the COO, who might want things done in a particular process, in a particular way, might be quite different to the message that you need to deliver to someone else who might find that their status in an organization might be negatively impacted by whatever change it is that you're bringing in. So thinking about that stakeholder picture and then working out the impacts on them and what the messages that they need to hear is really, really important.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? How to structure your message for different people depending on what they want to hear. And how do you figure out what it is that they're actually interested in so that you can tailor that message?
So we think about it, we've got a model based off some work by an American psychologist called Stephen Rees, who came up with 16 desires that he thinks that people are motivated by. And they're things like power, status, winning, idealism for some people, order for others. And there's then some more basic ones like eating, romance, physical exercise that hopefully are less relevant in the business setting. And he suggested he suggested that different people have these desires in different strengths. So some people will be heavily motivated by power. Some people might be heavily motivated by idealism, but we'll all be motivated by a balance of them. And when we came across this framework in Afghanistan and we were looking at why people had joined the Taliban, we'd created a list of reasons as to why people had joined the Taliban. And you could draw instant links between his framework of these 16 desires and the reasons that we were finding, whether it's people trying to look after their families, whether it was that they were quite low in status in society and wanted to raise that. And it was incredibly useful. But what Rees didn't focus on was fear, which is an even more important driver. So fear is an emotion that we all feel in response to threats. And threats come about in three ways, we think. There can be a change in situation, obviously, when you're bringing in a new system or changing the structure of something, that's a change to the situation. So that will create threats that people will view in different ways. There can be stimulated threats where someone says something that leads to someone perceiving this to be a threat. So the way that we message, we need to be careful that we're not triggering things unintentionally. And people can self-induce threats that really don't exist. So there is a change going on, maybe based off a lack of information or a misunderstanding of the situation, or just because people are really good at making things up in their head that don't exist, people can create threats that aren't there. So threats present fears, which are just the opposite to the 16 desires. So when we're looking at influencing people, we're looking at tapping into those desires. At times we're looking at removing those fears. Sometimes there are things that people really should be concerned about that they're not, because they're not aware of the full picture. So we might actually need to increase fear in someone, that if you don't do this, this is going to be the impact of this. And you really need to recognize this. You're a growing business, the systems that you've had in the past, they're just not going to keep up, and there's going to be disorder and chaos if we don't do something. That might be a message where we're actually trying to increase fear in someone. So when you mapped out your stakeholders, if you can work out what's personally relevant to them and align your program, your change with that in a positive way, then it's much more likely to be successful.
Fascinating. Yeah. Isabel,
very interesting. I have some views on this. I absolutely hear what you're saying. I love this concept of, breaking down the individual stakeholders and thinking about what motivates each of them. I'm interested in your point about fear, because I've been in the law firm game for a long time. And for the longest time, I was presenting the need to change, specifically digital transformation, but it can be any kind of change, from the perspective of the burning platform. If we don't do it, the alternative legal service providers will come in and you will have no more business left. I've been saying that since 2012. It's 10 years on, and guess what? The law firms have had the most successful year that they have ever had. Now, we all know that disruption creeps in, that it can just happen overnight. It may still be the case that the burning platform has some resonance, but I don't think in a law firm context it's necessarily always the best way to position the need to change. And I found it when I shifted off that sort of narrative onto opportunity more than change, we had much more success. So what does that mean? It means like if you are to change the way you work, the systems you use become more digital, speak more to your clients, what's the upside for you? Well, the upside is you'll get closer to your clients, you'll understand them better, you'll win more work, profitability will increase. And the burning platform narrative started to make people, I found, very defensive and wanting to prove me wrong all the time. And I used it for a long time as a device because I thought it would have impact, but it didn't have the impact that I would have wanted. And I don't know if you've read, Dan, I'm always plugging this book. I don't read a load of books like this, but this one is so brilliant. It's called Change. It's by Cotter. It's his most recent book. It's really, really excellent. And I just pulled out a quote before this webinar. I'm just going to read it to you. Bear with it, because it's a good one, I think. He's done loads of studies of what drives successful change in a corporate context, which is slightly different from the context that you were describing. This is what he says. We've seen that the most successful large-scale change efforts start with a clearly articulated, compelling, and emotionally inspiring opportunity. In an increasingly complex world with more threats and potential problems being thrown at us every day, it's becoming harder and harder to mobilize sustained action through a burning platform. The burning platform approach can create anxiety, anger, guilt, and stress, which can crush complacency, but can too quickly wear us out or result in a frozen deer in the headlights kind of panic. And certainly in a law firm context, and potentially in a corporate context, I've come across that. So I like to position it more as opportunity than fear.
So I think if you're kind of messaging at a broad population of people at the organizational level, absolutely, I agree. I think there's a real risk in kind of overplaying threats and then not appearing. So I think the situation that you've described is something that we're also seeing when we're trying to get people to change behavior around climate change. So there's lots of we're on a burning platform, there's not ever going to be any more snow in 5 years' time. People were saying that 20 years ago, and it does run the risk of people then ignoring the message. I think where it can work is when you kind of really personalize it. So based off a real good understanding of your individuals. So if there's a particular stakeholder that you need to win over, is there something that in their immediate life that there's a threat that they're not really aware of? And can you be the one that either highlights that? Are you the one that can actually remove it? So actually what we're going to do, you know, you're massively over capacity, you're working 16 hours a day. Actually, if we bring this in, that's going to remove some of that burden. It's going to streamline things. That can be removing a fear. Yeah. So we're not necessarily on about, you know, raising them all the time. It really is about how do you work out what is the right message for the right individual. And for some of them, you know, we'd go to increasing fear not as a last resort. It can be the appropriate technique, but I'd agree positive messaging generally works better, particularly at the broader level.
Yeah, but I definitely agree with you absolutely about, what was it you said that was so great? Something about influence is a team sport. I think that's absolutely right. And a mistake I've made myself and I've seen other people make, particularly in a law firm context where it is quite hierarchical, if I'm honest, is to appeal to a very small executive to drive the change, top-down change. You know, if the senior partner's doing it, everyone will do it. It just does not work. It does not work. You have to get that sort of sense of engaged volunteerism right the way through the organization. And again, if you can tap into opportunity at every stakeholder level, exactly the way you described, and articulate that and communicate it regularly in a way that feels authentic, then you get people actually and actively wanting to change and to be part of that, you know, upside potential.
Absolutely. And I think within kind of the organizational setting, you can often spot those people, particularly if it's a relatively kind of cohesive organization where you know your stakeholders. More difficult maybe to do at a kind of global level, but within a kind of constrained organization, you can usually work out like who's the person that everyone goes to kind of sanity check something. And they're frequently not the people at the C-suite level. It might just be someone who's been around a business, someone who's just highly respected. Can often be people actually quite low down the chain where it's like, you know, where people go to make their tea and coffee, they're the person who's always hanging out. It's like, oh, I've heard about this, what do you think? And they're the one who, if they kind of bless the change, they're the ones who will massively enhance your message for you.
Yeah.
And it can be much more effective. And, you know, if we're talking, we all are all overburdened with too many things to do. So if we can identify who's the best person to deliver the message for us to particular people, it saves us actually doing it. Which is, no one has enough time, do they? Yeah.
So true. And I think in a big corporate environment in particular, you have your senior leadership team who are there because they're either elected or they're promoted, and they are, by virtue of their position, important. And then you have those culture carriers, exactly as you're describing, who may not be the obvious people. They may just be people who've been there for a very long time, who really know how the system works, who people respect. And I don't want this in any way to sound disparaging, but at Freshfields, we had a post room, and the post room guys was like they were in that everybody's office. They knew everybody. They were the real, they were the messengers in every sense of the word, the corporate messengers. And if they were sort of on side, you were in a good place, you know. So it's as important to engage at every level of the organization if you want to communicate effectively. That is for sure.
Definitely. And Isabel, you highlight heavily in your book how important culture is just broadly for an organization that wants to drive innovation and change. Can you break that down for us a bit?
I'll try. It's a big one, isn't it? So it's such a sort of slippery construct, culture, isn't it? It's really mercurial. It's changing all the time. And, you know, it's very hard to really articulate exactly what makes the culture of a place. You think about a sort of healthy culture and a sort of startup culture. You think about ping pong tables and free beer on a Friday, and lovely open working spaces. And often, the physical environment can be in some ways a demonstration of the culture, but it's about a lot more than that, isn't it? Culture. The best way to describe it, I think, is what happens when people aren't watching. So how do the behaviors and interactions of the organization operate when they're not being scrutinized? And they can be the result of behaviors and norms that have built up over many, many years. And they're all sort of almost unsaid. It's just how you behave. You watch the partners and how they conduct themselves. and almost without thinking, you want to behave in the same way. So driving cultural change is really very challenging to do because it goes right to the root and to the heart of the organization. And very importantly too, the structure, the organizational structure, I'm sure you will have views on this, the organizational structure can be both a reflection of the culture and also can create the culture itself. So if you think about, a culture that's very hierarchical or has been structured in a way to calibrate its risk tolerance at a very sort of low level, i.e. wants to be very reliable, wants to be very stable. If it's got very homogeneous people in it, i.e. everyone looks the same, talks the same, not much diversity, that is the kind of culture that makes quick adaptive change quite difficult to achieve, if it's the kind of oil tanker analogy. And in the sort of law firm context, I don't want to beat up on law firms because there's lots of great things about partnerships. I grew up in a partnership. I love my time there. The teamwork can be really second to none. But traditional law firm partnerships are not well adapted to cultural change. They are hierarchy. They aren't diverse. These are just empirical facts. I'm not, making it up. They are bizarrely both sort of hierarchical and consensus driven. You have like 450 decision makers in the partners, so it's very hard to get decisions through. They have a very short-term investment horizon. And all of this means that the culture is not particularly adaptive. And to really thrive in what's become a very volatile and unpredictable world, I mean, look at the last 2 years and what we've all been through, right? We're on the brink of war in Ukraine, please God not, but that's happened. We've had the pandemic, we've had floods, fires, storming the capital, Brexit, everything. We've got to get used to unpredictability. We've all had to pivot. Organizations have to live with that unpredictability and be able to pivot too. So being an adaptive organization, having an adaptive culture is the most important quality an organization can have. And I mean, you can't break it down simply, but you have to look at how you're structured organizationally, the kind of people you hire and the diversity of those people, how decisions are made, how you harness opportunity and present that to your people, how you incentivize them. It's every level of the organization contributes to its culture and reflects it and drives it. So I don't think I have broken that down. I probably made it sound much more complicated, but it is a complicated issue.
It's complicated. And what interests me is if you're an in-house lawyer, if you're a GC or a person in a legal team, and you see the need to drive change within the organization to make legal more effective and also more efficient, how do you start? Because it's difficult, isn't it? Because you can't really have an impact on the overall organizational culture when you are a legal team in an in-house environment. So do you start with your own culture as your own legal team? Do you influence people? How do you do it?
Well, it's a very good question. I wish I had the answer to that. I could certainly write a few books and monetize that if I had the answer. I don't. But I think from what I've seen, particularly in the corporate legal team context, I've seen 2 examples of it being done very, very effectively. And I won't name the names of the organizations, but it all started by defining the purpose of the corporate legal team. So the question that this particular GC asked when looking at his legal team said, if McKinsey were to come in tomorrow and say to the CEO, right, we're going to outsource the whole legal team, what reason would you give for keeping it here? And the reason you give for keeping it here is your purpose. That's what you are uniquely contributing to this organization. And starting with that purpose, that sort of North Star, sounds trite, but I think it's true, is really, really important for driving change because people have to have something to anchor it around. And again, that can be opportunity. It can be, an opportunity to demonstrate greater value to the business. It can be a broader purpose. Certainly in another corporate legal team I'm thinking of in the pharmaceutical sector, they were effective in driving change through their legal team's organization when they really focused on the end customer and the fact that what they were doing within legal, speeding up the processes, getting to market more quickly, getting products out there, being, not being a blocker to the process, to the business, was actually helping people get the medication they needed at the point that they needed it. So they're contributing to the greater good. And I do feel that having purpose at the center of change is the most effective way to anchor it. And that should be your starting point. Again, though, that's not easy to do, I think.
And I think that that's key. So if you can tie your purpose as a legal team to the overall purpose of the business, and then you can communicate that to the people that you need to influence, I think that's the starting point. And we see it again and again, but often the legal team won't have a true understanding of the overall business strategy, because CEOs are really bad at communicating it. And it's really hard for you to get a clear kind of vision of where the business is going and how legal will support / accelerate that. So that's probably the first thing that I would say you need to do.
Align with the strategy, exactly right, and the purpose.
Speak the same language. If you're going to influence people, find out what they are passionate about, what they're afraid of, and what they want, and then frame your argument and your message so that it aligns in it, so you're speaking the same language.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think that's what you were saying as well, Dan, about the sort of finding that 16 desires, tapping into that purpose-driven change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other element to that is around kind of low-level behaviours. So if you can tie your low-level behaviours to your purpose, then you're doing both. So I'll give you an example. I worked in an organisation in the military where presenteeism was a real serious issue. Working 14, 16-hour days was viewed as being the thing that people did, and it was horrific. It was having really bad impacts on people. We changed some behaviours within the team that I worked at that fairly quickly rubbed off. So I was in a middle management role. I became the person who left the office earliest. I couldn't take my work home. We were working on classified systems, so it wasn't that I could go home and carry on working. So I had to do it myself. And it took a few weeks before some of those couple of slots down from me began to copy those behaviours. And that drove some positive change in our area. But it's got to be done at the right level. So someone in a parallel organisation where this kind of hours that we were only going to work had agreed that they were going to do this the same, and someone caught them working under a blanket in their office so that someone couldn't see that they were still there. And that's kind of an example of, of where those behaviours aren't being copied and aren't being mirrored. And you've got to, those small scale behavioural changes that you can clearly demonstrate, I think if you can tie them to your purpose, you can get a kind of virtuous circle, a bit of a snowball effect. And people start to copy good things, I think.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The human sort of behaviours are so important. And I've reflected on this a lot because people want to see evidence that change is working, and absolutely they should, right? If you've funded a change program, you want to know that it's working. But I'm more and more convinced that sort of hard P&L data, at least in the early stages, is actually damaging to the sort of change effort, because it can be so easily picked apart and it's so difficult to prove. And you're better off, in my view, rather than obsessing about, are we proving it in metrics, looking for the sort of leading indicators that cultural change is biting. And that can be through human behaviors. And again, I was talking to the group legal COO of a large bank who had started within his legal team to get them to sort of white label their knowledge and productize it and commercialize it to other parts of the business and also to other financial services teams. So very exciting new development for that legal team, something that not many other legal teams are doing. And he was coming under pressure to say, how much revenue is this going to make? How much revenue is this? And he said, it's not about the revenue. The revenue will be great. There will be revenue, but this is about our legal team suddenly realizing that their unique legal perspective and advice has a value, that they didn't recognize before, that it has a market value. And so the leading indicator for him was the fact that he had, however many proposals for new ideas coming through that funnel, because the team was engaged and making change. So not obsessing too early about the wrong metrics is also really important, I think.
We had a really specific question that came up in the previous webinar, because we're always banging on about having a legal intake form and how important that is. Because if you're an in-house legal team and you're super busy, you're accepting requests from Slack, Teams, email, the kitchen, someone calls you, it's just really impossible for you to triage everything that comes into your function and deliver it effectively. So you're not just doing the work of the person who's shouting the loudest, you're doing the work that's actually the most important and that needs to be done. Plus, you are collecting data, because
Yeah.
if you've got a funnel, now you know that 20% of the requests are coming from the marketing team, and they're all around the same topic. And now you can go away and design a training so that you don't have to answer the same questions. And that's how you build scalability through data. But
Absolutely.
you need that funnel, right? You need that one channel that's going to allow you to collate everything in one place. And the question we always get from people, and this is such a fair question, is, but won't that introduce friction and therefore make us less accessible and popular?
Well, only if it's done badly. I mean, it doesn't. I think a digital, we're slightly going off topic, but so I won't dwell on it. But I think a digital legal front door that handles intake in a really, effective way is a very sophisticated way of digitizing the white glove service, and provides much more transparency for the customer, the internal client, than, I've called Tom, he hasn't got back to me. If it's done well, it's a much, much better and more effective tool. And I've seen this in action, and this is public domain, so I can share the name. DXC Technologies legal team have their own digital sort of front door and platform specifically for intake. And it's more effective and liked more by their internal clients than the old system of sort of shoulder taps. It's had the reverse effect. It's freed them up to do the really complex stuff, provided the work is triaged in the right way and going to the right people. I mean, it should be a really effective mechanism.
And I agree. And I've seen it in action, and it really works, and people actually like it because they can almost self-serve. But I think that's just a good example of something that lawyers avoid doing because they think it's going to make them less accessible and therefore, as a result, less popular. And if you've grown up in a law firm and you've gone in-house, that idea of always being available and always, it's almost like you can't have any boundaries. Sorry. We're fetching. But yeah, it's like we're not allowed to have boundaries.
But it's what Dan said, it's the ego fit. It's the ego here, isn't it? This is somebody thinking, I want to be wanted. That's what they're deriving their status from. And I get it. We all get it. We've all had it, I'm sure. And I suppose you just have to, in your example, then you have to sort of break that down and attack that particular, one of your 16 desires in a particular way.
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. Yes.
That's right.
So Dan, if you wanted to introduce a change in an organization that you know that some people will perceive as additional friction or a barrier, how would you go about it? Would you start by highlighting the good things that are going to come out of it, or the bad things that are going to come out of it if they don't do it?
So I'd want to work out who was feeling different things. So we talked much earlier about, the stakeholder picture. That would be the first step. I'd want to work out who I needed to influence. I'd want to work out in what way. It's unlikely that all of those individuals will feel the same way about this thing. They might have different concerns internally. Some of your team might have different concerns. So, is the CEO bothered that he's going to lose his hotline to his in-house team, and that's going to somehow diminish his status as the CEO of the organisation? What's the message to him that we really need to deliver? That might be very different to someone else in procurement, for example, who might be regularly funneling stuff to you of a fairly routine nature, and they might have different concerns. And it'll be working out, again, what's the right message for the right person and who's the best person to deliver that. So that's the process that I would go through. And in larger organisations where maybe you don't necessarily know all of the individuals, it might make it more difficult. You can do some kind of stereotyping around roles. So certain people in certain roles are likely to be concerned about this kind of thing. Certain people in certain roles are likely to be concerned about other things. And therefore, we might need some different messaging. And stereotypes have a really bad reputation. They're viewed as being, incredibly unuseful, but they exist for a reason, in that they're a bit of a shortcut to working out decision-making. And as long as we challenge our views when we get access to new information, so it might be that we've stereotyped everyone in a particular role as being concerned about something. If we get new information that says, well, actually that's slightly wrong, then we need to adapt and change. So stereotypes are only bad if we become really kind of constricted by them, if that makes sense.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Sorry, Electra. Well, it's not actually a follow-up, it's a kind of allied question, but I'm really interested in your answer to this, Dan. So I've been thinking a lot about the role of leadership in driving change, and we often tend to think about great leaders as being the real change makers. I don't know, pick whoever you want, Nelson Mandela, whoever it might be, who can really inspire, you know, a large body of people to change at scale, at speed. But reflecting on now, you know, the quantity of change, the volatility, the macroeconomic volatility that we're all living through, I'm wondering whether we can really depend on, you know, many more of these fantastic individuals coming forward to inspire us. And what, with your kind of military background, what your view is on whether, you know, leadership by an individual is really important in driving the change, or whether it needs to be more sort of atomized, or maybe it's a combination of both.
So the British military has a kind of approach to task-based sort of operational leadership, something called mission command, which is where the highest level, the commander sets their intent and says, this is what I'm trying to achieve. And leaders at all levels, right the way down to the lowest junior NCO, should know what that intent is so that they can act in accordance with it. And I think that kind of approach isn't used enough in large organisations, where it's felt like there's got to be a high level of control further up the organisation, sometimes maybe a lack of trust in individuals to make decisions in accordance with someone's intent. And I think as a way of driving change, and leadership does exist, you know, everywhere. We have 360-degree leadership these days. I think from the newest person into an organisation will be leading some aspects of things from a very early age. So I think, you know, if we can describe effectively the intent that we're trying to drive through a particular change, and actively ask people to work towards that independently, dynamically, accept that sometimes they'll make mistakes and might do things that don't necessarily align with the intent that we'd set, but that as long as everyone's broadly pushing in the same direction, getting that independent action is likely to lead to overall success, I think.
Yeah, I like that. So the sense that, you know, leadership and management are two different concepts. You know, it doesn't have to be the managers that are leading. You can lead at all levels in the organisation. Yeah, that's a very interesting.
And in the army, certainly, they talk about commands, which is where you have formal responsibility that's assigned with a particular role. They talk about leadership and management. So we go on CLM courses where we talk about, these are your command functions at this particular rank. This is kind of what we expect you to do as a leader, and management. And they're talked about as three overlapping circles, if you like. And I think there's something there around change as well, that there will be responsibility for things and for delivering things. There will be a management function that is about process and gateways and KPIs. And the leadership can sit at a whole host of different levels within an organisation to do that. And empowering it. I think that's one of the reasons that there's been a lot of talk over the last 5-6 years around viral change and looking at how that can work. And, you know, there are organisations out there who will come in and work out what your viral change networks are in your team. And I think that's kind of tying into that sense that you know, change needs to be led at low levels as well as from a formal programme.
So viral change is right in your wheelhouse, isn't it, Electra? I mean, you think about 1MDA and how that became, I think, a viral phenomenon to change the legal industry, really.
Well, yeah, I think 1MDA was I think about it a lot, because I think that it's just had a huge impact in a small period of time, in a short period of time. And I think the reason is that it just captured people's imagination, and they felt that they were empowered to drive change themselves. So by involving the whole community in an open source project to do something that makes sense, I think that just inspires people. And being inspirational whilst leading change, I think, is really important. And having a vision and a mission that people can feel for emotionally is important. So it's not just about KPIs. It's not just about, this is going to save you money. This is going to make you feel really good. is something that's important and probably underestimated when we're planning change. And I think another thing is we see lots of in-house legal teams going out and buying tech and thinking that that's going to be transformational just on its own, or introducing a new process and thinking that that's going to have an impact. But I would always say that the first thing to think about before you do anything is how you're going to deliver this. So start to strategize before you take action. And often we feel like we're quite action driven, aren't we, as lawyers, and we're rewarded on our productivity from a very young age. But taking a step back and planning what this is going to do, who it's going to impact, how it's going to impact them, who your stakeholders are, what they care about, what they don't care about, how you're going to deliver the message is the first step to a successful transformation project, whether that's on a small scale or a larger scale in a huge organization. And then once you've done that, start small and deliver a change that works, which is what One NDA was aiming to do. We started off with the One NDA, but the vision is much bigger. Standardization can absolutely transform the legal industry, and we hope to take it to that level with the help of the community. But we had to start with an NDA because people get it and people hate them. So it's perfect.
Yeah, I think that's right. And starting small and really celebrating, again, this sounds very trite, but it's so true. Celebrating successes over and over again. You can't over communicate that, because having driven other kinds of change, not just digital HR change through a large law firm, when things go wrong, they go so viral. Like once something is bad news, then that's out there and there's very little you can sort of do about it. And I was just looking at the question in the chat that said, how would you measure who's displeased or resistant to the change? And I was sort of thinking it over. Thank you for the question. I thought, well, I've said data isn't important. Data is, you shouldn't rely wholly on it. It is important. And when we at Freshfields built a service centre up in Manchester, which was a big change for the firm at the time, and almost entirely new employees, and it was a lot of adjustment that we had to go through, and to work out who was, who there were some metrics about how much work was going up there, which would obviously say whether people were pleased or displeased with the change, but you couldn't rely on that, on the data. It was really like the grapevine. And I know that sounds ridiculous and doesn't sound scalable, but you have to be plugged in, have your tentacles in and really listening, like by the water cooler, in the lunch queue, talking to people, because that's where you really work out what people really think about what you're trying to achieve. And I'm not sure how you scale that, if that's part of Maggie's question, but you have to have people who are human enough driving the change effort to really plug into the corporate psychology, I think.
Yeah, I listened to a great podcast which was about Airbnb and how they made it. And they were just talking about how it kind of applies to startups, but I think it can apply to any function in any organization that's trying to do something new. They talk about how you have to handcraft the first bit. So whenever you do something new, you can't think about scalability, because that's not the point. The point is to really get under the hood. And to get under the hood, you need to forget how scalable it is, and you need to forget how repeatable the work can be. And really just, with Airbnb, the founders went and slept on people's sofas to understand how they were perceiving their products before they went and scaled. And then you get into scaling mode and you have to use a completely different part of your brain.
That's exactly the same as Jet.com, who were acquired by Walmart back in the day. And they were a very early sort of e-commerce business in New York. And they were so customer centric, they would phone up every single one of their customers personally in the early days to work out what was really motivating them. And it was that level of commitment and like really digging into what the customer thought that made them so successful. And that's why they were acquired, for multi-billions very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think being able, this is off topic, but as a founder or as a person in an organization that's trying to drive change, being able to switch between that mindset of handcrafting versus operational scaling is key to success. And you don't need to be doing it all on your own. You just need to know who within your team is able to support each of those bits. But if you're the person who wants to lead change, I think it's important to speak to people, which goes right back to design thinking principles. Number one step is empathy, discovery, understanding how people are feeling. Chat to people, I think, is probably the first the first step towards understanding who's going to be displeased. And often I make assumptions a lot. I've realized I make so many assumptions. I just think things and then I think they're true because I think them. And then you speak to people and they're not half as worried as what you thought. And they're not half as pleased as what you thought. Yeah. So actually asking people direct questions, which again, for lawyers, that's not always in our comfort zone, is the first way to figure out how people are feeling.
And can I give one real practical tip on a simple thing you can do to improve that when you're going to people? Is often when people talk about asking questions, they're told that asking open questions like who, what, where, why, when is really good, and you'll get more information than if you answer a closed question. We actually add a layer above that, which is to use a tell, explain, or describe. So if you're going to someone and you think they might be displeased or resistant to the change, and you say, explain how this has impacted you, there's still a how in there, which is the open bit, but adding that tell, explain, or describe gets you immeasurably more information coming back from that person. And for anyone who wants to test this, particularly if you have teenage children or kids of any age really who go to school, typically they'll come back from school and you will often say, how was your day? And invariably, certainly if you're anything like me as a parent, the kind of response you'll get is, it was all right. And that's probably as far where the conversation will stop. Add a tell, explain, or describe. So explain to me what you did today, describe your day. You will get far, far more information back. And it's exactly the same when you're trying to understand what people don't like, what they're resistant to. And it's adding that kind of narrative command of, tell me what you think's wrong with this is a command. It's not a question. You'll get far more feedback from people by doing that.
That is so interesting. I love that tip. And also for lawyers in particular, words are so important, aren't they, Electra? Like words are what really, people focus on. And one of again, to Maggie's question, when we were trying to work out whether our digital transformation strategy and communications were working, the point where I thought, we're actually having an impact was when people started speaking the language back to us. So they would use vocabulary we were using to describe how the firm was operating, like capabilities, or I can't think of an example now, but words that they never agile, words I'd never heard them use before, coming back. And I thought, right, if the lawyers are using our language, we've won, So that's it. I think words are very important.
Agreed. There's another question here, which is really interesting from Juliet, and I think we should definitely touch upon. How can we spot the right people to drive change in an environment where engagement is more virtual than it has been in the past? That's so true, because when you're in an office with people, you can catch a vibe, and you can't really do that when everyone's on Zoom and Slack. So how do you start? I don't actually know the answer to that question.
What do I? I'm going to throw that to Dan.
So I think that's something we've seen a massive change in how people influence over the last 2 years. We work with a lot of organisations who are involved in kind of selling into other organisations, and they're now trying to build relationships with people they've never met, which is incredibly difficult. And we talk about rapport as being really important, and you kind of going through a natural kind of build up of rapport. And video calls, invariably that gets minimized or cut off, in that we might go through a minimal dance of it before we move on to the purpose of our video call in a way that we really wouldn't if we were face to face. So I think you've got to be a lot more deliberate and conscious about how you go and find out who the right people are to drive change. It might be that you're doing some formal kind of questioning. So going out to a subset of people to say, who is it who you listen to in our business these days? And there's methodologies that some of these viral change organizations do where they will do just that. They will send out questionnaires to people to say, who is it who you listen to in this organization? Who is it who you're regularly in communication with? And you might choose to do that really formally by sending out a questionnaire online or something like that. You might just choose to do it through a series of structured conversations where you're going to different people who you know are going to be impacted by the change and say, who is it who in this organization now you listen to? And you can call out the facts that we're missing information due to everyone remote working now. That's something that I'll consciously do in my interactions with people. I'll say, usually we'd be meeting face to face and I would do this. I can't. So tell me a little bit about yourself, or, where are you? And kind of consciously do that. And you can do exactly the same with other aspects of this around, normally as a change person, I would be able to pick up on who it is, who the movers and shakers are in this organisation. I can't, so I need you to tell me, and just be quite open and explicit about it. Can get through some of those barriers.
Yeah, I think definitely that's right. It's a different kind of listening skill you have to employ. I've done a number of sort of consultancy engagements over Zoom, which I never would have thought were possible. And you've got to listen in a very different way and practice a different kind of empathy and really read between the lines. I do think there's a particular skill to change anyway, and it is a very human skill. And you have to sort of ramp that up on steroids a bit when you're in a virtual environment. But it is possible to do it. I don't know about you, but I haven't found it that much more difficult to relate to people over a screen than personally. It's just a different set of skills, I think.
Yeah, with One NDA, I think the reason it was so successful was because of, well, to an extent, lockdown, because we spoke to 150 lawyers in a month, and we were on back-to-back half-an-hour calls with people, which we could do because it's just easier for people to just jump on a call. So there are benefits to it in that people will potentially give you more time because it's easier to jump on a call than it is to get on a tube and go across town and have a meeting with someone, or arrange a meeting with someone in a team and then book a room and all that. So it is easier to get people's time. But I think you're right. And I actually find it really energy draining being on Zoom calls and trying to understand how people are feeling, because I'm constantly trying to read people's faces, and you can't do that. And you do get an energy when you're in a room with someone. You know, when if someone's sitting next to me and they're stressed, I can feel it. And you don't get those feelings when you're not in a room with someone. So I think it's easier to get people's time, but it's harder to affect change because it's just so much more, it's tiring.
I find myself really like overacting on Zooms. I'm like, yeah. And then nobody else does it. I was like, God, just tone it down. But because I want to sort of communicate my feelings to people. And I'm just like, I need to get a handle on that.
So Isabel, you're actually doing something that I think a lot of people don't, and you've got your hands on show a lot. Yes. And we communicate an awful lot of information via our hands that we don't think. They haven't really worked out how that works. So when you're talking and you're moving your hands and you're adding emphasis and you're saying how big something is, they haven't quite worked out how we're coordinating what we're saying, which we're making up as we go along, with what our hand gestures are doing. No one really understands it, but there's a huge amount of information conveyed by your hands. And that's the kind of thing, Electra, that you're missing out on, which is why it's so much more tiring, because you're trying to process the limited stuff you have got. And even with, your hands on display, you're missing out on a whole load of other body language that you would be picking up on. And yeah, it's just the more you can do to kind of either call that out and be explicit about it, ask questions that maybe you wouldn't have done otherwise, because you'd be picking up on it, I think is ways that we can mitigate some of that.
Yeah. And just on an associated point on sort of timing and change generally, like your point, Electra, part of the reason it went so viral was lockdown. And I do think with change efforts, sometimes you can get lucky and it's serendipitous. You happen to launch at a time when it's the world is ready, but you can pick your time, make sure that it's the right time for the organization. There's not too much other stuff going on. Really think about how you position and start and launch your change effort, because if it's too much noise, you're just not going to be heard. But the environment has to be ready, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Just a note to everyone: if you've got questions, just drop them in the Q&A or the chat. We're about to drop off in 5 minutes, but we've got some time to respond to questions if there are any. But before we go, Dan, what would you say your top tip is for anyone who wants to drive change?
Don't think that it's you that's got to do all the influencing. Influence is a team sport. Work out who else is on your team and who they are best placed to influence for you. That, I think, is one of the biggest things. People think of influence as an individual skill, and it's not. It's a team effort.
Thank you. Isabel?
I would say top tip, never use the Kodak or Netflix example when you're trying to say, drive change, look what happened to them. It's just, or boiling frogs, don't use it. And always present something as an opportunity, not a burning platform. It's just a more effective way to harness people's hearts and minds.
Lovely.
What's your top tip, Electra?
My top tip is plan your change before you start doing, and think about the people that are involved and their personalities. And you can definitely stereotype, I think, and it's really useful actually. You can stereotype and say the CFO is interested in money. I mean, obviously. So it is a shortcut, and to start thinking about people's desires and fears and mapping out what you're going to do and how, and the messages that you're going to deliver is really important. And you'll save yourself a lot of time and money if you do that first before you go out and buy something or do something.
Like it. I'm just putting that John Cotter book in the chat. I haven't got the link, but you'll find it. It's really, really, really good. I can't recommend it highly enough.
Well, I should read that ASAP.
It's good.
Great. Well, thank you both. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you.
You.
Really had fun there. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
It's so good to meet you, Dan. I shall be tapping into your expertise somehow. I can feel it. It's such a great background. It's really fascinating.
Brilliant. Lovely to meet you too.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Electra, for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, audience. Take care. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.